It's rather ironic that the very thing Ainz seeks the most is also what he happens to worry about the most. As a person who prefers to be prepared for pretty much everything, it's his fellow Yggdrasil players that bring with them the most uncertainty. Sure, finding one would be rather ideal, but it's when he finally does that the circumstances need to be right. Whether he's met with open arms or aggressive hostility is completely up to him and the choices he makes for his nation. Thus the reason he's heading to the Dwarven Kingdom now. What the anime has left out though is a massive prologue setting all this up. Crucial details regarding the runes, the dwarves, and this whole expedition that really help you understand why it's so important. So, just like how we did before, let's take a look at what the anime missed from the novels. Let's get started. Episode 44 Part 1, In Pursuit of the Land of Dwarves, covering a brief epilogue from Volume 10, as well as Chapters 1 and 2 from Volume 11. This whole scene we see between Albedo and Demiurge was the final wrap-up to the Ruler of Conspiracy arc. It was mainly to clue us in as to what's been going on elsewhere, as well as show us a few reactions to Ainz's unintentional success. So, with Demiurge having reached the final stages of his plans for the Sacred Kingdom, he was here now seeking approval for the use of a doppelganger. Whatever he was planning to do to finish his mission over there, it clearly required the talents of a shapeshifter. But when Albedo went on to tell him that Ainz wasn't here, the emotion with which she said it was rather different from how she usually would. Sure, she definitely had the same look like how she usually did, but even Demiurge with his all-seeing observant eyes was still incapable of pinpointing what she was hiding. She was actually the only person alongside Ainz who he couldn't read properly. That being the case, it was a little bit frustrating to not be able to do so, but when reminded that her being an exception was actually a good thing, looking past it was significantly easier. Now, with Ainz gone and no one else around, Demiurge then inquired as to where the other floor guardians were. Well, with Shaltir and Aura out with Ainz, Cocytus was managing the lake area, Sibas was working in Arantal, then Mare was building a dungeon on the outskirts of Arantal. Not much else was said otherwise, but no one was slacking when it came to putting in work for Nazarick. When Albedo posed her question to Demiurge next, Demiurge had actually gone to mention the 3 things he needed to subdue the Empire. The first was having Ainz make a move himself, the second was about a month's worth of time, then the third was a riot in a major city of the Empire. Those were the core components behind how he would have done it. Since having Ainz act on his behalf was out of the question though, Demiurge always thought it was simpler to just conquer the kingdom first. That way their ability to pressure the Empire would be significantly easier. But when Demiurge heard that Ainz had done it in 3 days, the emotions he felt were a jumble of rapture, envy, awe, and respect. It was an indescribable passion that reassured Demiurge of just how intelligent Ainz was, much to the point that he was starting to become jealous of Pandora's actor for it. Regardless, if there was one thing that Demiurge knew for certain now, it was that there truly was no way him or anyone else could come even close to their master's intellect. What makes this thought so particularly funny though is the context that comes after when Ainz is thinking to himself about what just happened here. He was extremely confused and anxious over Jerkniv suddenly wanting to become a vassal state, so much so that he just wanted to go far away and leave it to Demiurge and Albedo. So, while thinking of ways to avoid the hassle of all these politics, Ainz remembered the runes he saw at Osk's place, an important thought he felt could potentially lead him to another player. Reason being that, amongst all the questions he had about their existence in the New World, the most important was the implications of what a runecrafter class could mean for him. Since Yggdrasil didn't have a class called Runecraft, that meant this class was specific to the New World. The thing is, if the writing they used for runes was something unique to Yggdrasil, then that meant someone must have taught them it. 100 years ago during the peak of Runecraft, it's very possible an Yggdrasil player could have taught the dwarves this craft and created a fusion of techniques that blended ones from both worlds. So, out of the hopes of finding more information, Ainz knew he needed to investigate it. The only problem was that, if there was in fact a player behind these runes, then the possibility of it being the one who brainwashed Shaltir needed to be considered as well. So, it was too risky to send anyone other than himself since he knew best how to deal with players. Of course, going alone would be just as foolish as well, so Ainz began to consider which bodyguards would be best to bring with him. And because all he needed was brute force to buy time for a retreat, the best candidates were obviously any of the level 100 floor guardians. The thought of using them as shields did make him feel a bit emotional, but when he remembered how resurrection was always an option, Ainz began to think it was a bit more reasonable. What made him truly accept this plan though was the opinion of the maid who was watching him that day. You see, while unsure as to whether to use the Guardians or not, Ainz had asked the maid if she was willing to die for him. When the maid didn't hesitate to say yes, Ainz then asked if all the others would as well. And it was the maid's response to this that would ensure Ainz it was okay to mobilize the NPCs. You see, while yes, they were his friend's precious creations, at the end of the day they were created to serve him. What Ainz was always forgetting to consider was that following his orders was the most fulfilling thing that any of them could do for him. So, with no more doubts on what he should do, Ainz would retrieve the 2 floor guardians not currently doing anything, then formulate a plan on how to approach the Dwarf Kingdom, bringing us to a massive section the anime had left out in order to get to the main stuff faster. Before we get to that though, it was at the beginning of Volume 11 where a prologue detailing the dwarves was given to us. It's not extremely crucial to the plot, but it does develop Gondo while setting up his presence in Feorido, the abandoned city we find him in later on in the episode. Initially, he was just doing a normal day's work mining heat stones in their new city, but it was this day in particular that was rather special. You see, Gondo had just finished saving up to buy the equipment he needed for a journey. Despite everyone's warnings not to, he was heading off to the abandoned city to mine for white iron. Sure, he could just try to mine for it here as a worker of the state, but the bonus he would make for that was marginal in comparison to if he was to mine for it himself. If he went to Feorido though, that meant that he could mine, keep, and sell whatever ore that he wanted. There wouldn't be anyone telling him to give his work to the state, and everything he did mine could be sold to whoever he wanted. It was a high-risk, high-reward endeavor that would provide the money needed for what he really wanted to do. He didn't really specify what that was, but the core motivation behind it was to rediscover lost technology. He was setting out on this risky journey in hopes of continuing his father's research, a lofty endeavor which required both money and white iron. Any white iron would be used directly with the research, and everything else would be sold to assist with that. It was the least Gondo felt he could do to live up to the magnificent man that was his father. You could even say it was his very reason for living. Switching back to the main story now, and there was a whole bunch of scenes left out regarding Ainz's preparations for the Dwarf Kingdom. It's a bit too long to go into extreme detail in, so instead I'll just summarize a lot of the main aspects. First, Ainz was given a brand new outfit in preparation for a meeting with the Lizardmen. This wasn't the same meeting from the anime, but instead a one-on-one with the former Razor-tailed chieftain Kyuku. It was a meeting Cocytus had set up to give an update on the status of the Lizardmen village. The update itself was just a lengthy handwritten letter, but Kyuku was the one sent to deliver it, giving Ainz the opportunity to ask him a few questions after the fact. So, after talking about Zardyusu, his wife, and his newborn child, Ainz then went on to inquire about the dwarves, a question that would lead to an answer he never would have expected. You see, when Ainz had heard that the dwarves liked to mine a rare metal on par with adamantite and orichalcum, he couldn't help but hope that it would be prismatic ore. The reason why this is because prismatic ore was the key to making a world item, the caloric stone which his guild had accidentally come across after monopolizing the ore from a celestial uranium mine. By placing this valuable mineral all together in a vault in Nazarick, the result was a natural reaction which went to form this powerful world item. It was one that his guild would have liked to farm to have more of, but before that could happen, another guild had stolen the mine from them. They had used their own world item to lock Ainz out of it. So, if this rare dwarven metal was the prismatic ore from Yggdrasil, then Ainz could potentially start to farm this world item. If not, at the very least he could get information on what other ores were out there, making his trip to the Dwarven Kingdom even more important than it was before. Part of the reason why these unknown materials were so important was because more than once Ainz had come across items that were impossible to make in Yggdrasil. Weapons like Gazif's sword and Zardyusu's frostpane were all pieces of equipment whose origin was unknown to him. Perhaps if he learned more about how this world's crafting worked though, then items like that would no longer be a mystery to him. Not only would he not be caught off guard by weapons he couldn't prepare for, but he could also manufacture them to make his arsenal even stronger. Yet another facet to Nazarick that would improve its overall influence. So, if Ainz could somehow get some dwarves to join his nation, then he would pretty much have every aspect of craftsmanship covered by someone. The librarian was making scrolls with Demiurge's materials, Nefaria was handling potions, Fluter was in charge of magic development, then the dwarves would be tasked with equipment crafting. It was a good start to advancing Nazarick towards the future. What Ainz was really concerned about though was the 600-year head start the 6 gods had in front of him. You see, if these 6 gods truly were players from Yggdrasil, then it was very likely they could have taken the same measures that Ainz had. If a person as average as Suzuki Setoru could, then Ainz thought for sure that any player could. So, in the off chance that this was in fact true, Ainz knew he had to be careful of impeding on another player's research. The dwarves could very well be crafting items for another player already, making this journey far more dangerous than he thought before. That being the case, Ainz would bring along more than just Shaltir and Aura, but initiate the meeting as a diplomatic one at first. Ideally, he would have liked to handle the situation similar to how he did with Ainzak. If a player did attack and prove to be trouble though, then Ainz and his army would have a justifiable cause to retaliate, and retrieving the knowledge he wanted would simply be a matter of pulling it from the rubble after. As for what that knowledge was, well, the main priorities were as follows. First was the presence of any player. Next, the investigation of the runes and their origins, then finally the attainment of dwarven smithing technology and their knowledge. Those were the key things Ainz was hoping to discover here. There was a bit more to Ainz's thoughts, but that's pretty much the essence of what he was prepping for. He did hear from Kyuku that a lizard man had more information, but that wasn't something he'd act on until a little bit later. Instead, what came first was the additional scouting information from Ainzak and Fluter, then a meeting with Aura and Shaltir to prep them for their upcoming mission. Since neither Ainzak nor Fluter knew much about the dwarves, that left the only remaining lead as Zenburu, the lizard man we saw Ainz talking to in the anime. Before we get to that though, Ainz first had to go about informing Shaltir of her new responsibilities. Since all she'd been doing was opening gates for the denizens of Nazarick, there was an important handoff that needed to be done so that Mare could take over for her. Remember, ever since Shaltir had become mind-controlled by the enemy, she'd been restricted to surveillance duties within the confines of Nazarick. So, when Ainz had told her she'd finally be part of something major again, she was ecstatic to be presented with the opportunity to finally get to prove herself. First things first though, Mare needed to receive the ring of Ainz Gon, as well as be thoroughly briefed on what his responsibilities were. So, until that task was done, Ainz would wait in Arantel while briefing Aura. Now, a quick thing to note about the ring being left behind is that it was very important to Ainz none of them ever leave the insides of Nazarick. Reason being that the threat it posed from being stolen was simply far too great. That's why the only person allowed to carry a ring outside was Ainz as a precaution just in case the entrance to Nazarick got blocked off somehow. Should that happen and no one else possess a ring, then Nazarick would forever be locked out to anyone outside of it. So aside from that and the ones the Floor Guardians were permitted to carry within Nazarick, all the others were hidden within the pile of gold in the treasury, making it very difficult for invaders to ever get their hands on it. Moving on to Ainz's private discussion with Aura now, it was here that he explained why he had chosen Shaltir for this mission. You see, because Shaltir knew she was one of the strongest in Nazarick, that mindset had led her to limit the way she thought about battle. Rather than approach things with strategy like how Ainz does, she instead chooses to do so with force. Thus the reason she had lost to Ainz in Season 1. What Ainz had told Aura was that if Shaltir approached the battle a different way, there was no way he would have ever been able to beat her. More specifically, had she started with Inhiriar then prepped as many spells as possible, the combined barrage with the follow-up of Blood Frenzy and CQC with the Pipette Lance would have easily overwhelmed Ainz to the point of retreat. So, that lack of strategy and the suboptimal gear limiting her overall power were the only things preventing Shaltir from being one of the best at PvP. That being the case, in addition to Ainz using this mission to stimulate Shaltir's growth, he would also have Aura watch over her to guide her along a bit, allowing for a more streamlined method of granting her experience. It was a standard training policy Ainz had read from a business book after being transported here. Now, once all was said and done, the entire team chosen for the mission from Nazarick was 6 vampire brides and 25 undead from Shaltir's family, 5 Hanzos Ainz had recently summoned, then 30 Death Knights and several of Aura's magical beasts. This would be the team with which Ainz would set out to go see Cocytus with, finally bringing us to the start of the episode. It was once there that Ainz deemed it was finally time to give Cocytus a reward. You see, with Albedo and Mare having rings of Ainz Gon, Aura a watch featuring the voice of Buku Buku Chagama, Shaltir the encyclopedia from Peroronchino, then Demiurge the demon statue that Ulbert made, that left Cocytus as one of the few loyal guardians left to not have received a reward from him. That being the case, Ainz insisted Cocytus request something from him, something more than just a desire to serve him. Since Cocytus couldn't come up with something immediately though, Ainz would give him a week to choose what he wanted, a gift I hope we'll see sometime later in the anime. Now, when Ainz started talking to Zenburu next, An important bit of discussion worth pointing out was the extremely bold attitude he had taken with regards to the dwarves topic. Because they had once helped him out in the past, Zenbadu had said that if Ainz was going to end up being hostile to them, he wouldn't hesitate to join them and fight against him. It was an act of defiance that Cocytus was ready to execute him right there for. What Ainz had done to take care of it himself, though, was warn Zenbadu of the consequences of him doing so. You see, Zenbadu may have thought that his rebellion wouldn't be consequential to anyone else, but Ainz made sure to tell him that it very well could be. Should Zenbadu choose to go against Nazarick, then the possibility of Ainz annihilating the entire village wasn't completely out of the question. Like, if Zenbadu's little act would encourage others to do the same, then wiping them out would be the only option remaining to him. Of course, Ainz wasn't actually going to do that, but this heavy-handed warning was certainly enough to discourage Zenbadu from doing anything rash. Now, fighting the dwarves was just as unlikely as well, but Ainz knew he still needed to be cautious of other players. You see, the whole reason he wanted to establish friendly relations was mainly so he could demonstrate just how diplomatic his sorcerer kingdom could be. If he went to war with the dwarves while making the empire his vassal, then any other player in the world would quickly come to see him as a force of evil. If he made allies instead, though, his sorcerer kingdom wouldn't be seen as such a hostile place anymore. It could even become this hub where players might go to team up with him. So, the major issue this type of relationship avoided was the establishment of player teams who would want to fight against him. Like, in the worst case scenario where the sorcerer kingdom became perceived as this nation of evil, it would only be natural for other players to team up and try to defeat it. And that was one of the few things that Ainz truly feared within this new world. What scared him wasn't an individual player or even a hostile nation, but instead a group of skilled players teaming up against him. That, a player with a world item or a player with a class like World Champion were the only things Ainz wasn't sure Nazarick could defend against. But yeah, that's pretty much it for everything prior to the journey. There was a bit more to be said about Zardiusu and his family, but that pertained more to the perspective of another race coming to live with humans. Long story short, the anxiety that would come from being in a whole different country wasn't something Zardiusu or his family thought they would want to go through. In any case, with that covering about the first third of the episode, the next will cover the rest and perhaps even some of the next. It all depends on how much was cut. It does seem like they're increasing their pacing a bit, but I do believe they're capturing a majority of the story. Overall, it's been pretty coherent so far. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!